All right, this is video one in the Cold War note packet. Today we're going to go over some background information and cover the topics Berlin airlift, Cuban Missile Crisis, Korean and Vietnam Wars in section one. Also intermixed throughout that will be some of the vocab words, so we'll jump back and forth between those. These are some images from the Cold War. And so let's go through and look at some of a brief summary of some of the major events that existed during the Cold War. First of all, let's define the term Cold War. Remember the last thing you wrote down from World War II was about two countries that used to be allies that became enemies after World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union, and those are the basic two sides, the communist versus democratic side that existed during the Cold War. So as an event, this is a good definition for it, a state of political hostility between countries, primarily the United States and Soviet Union, characterized by threats, propaganda, and other measures short of open warfare. So we're actually going to look at two examples of open warfare that happened during the Cold War, but the majority of battles that existed in the Cold War were more philosophy versus philosophy, or image versus image. And so they weren't really on the battlefield with guns firing at each other like World War II was. They were just wars of who has the superior culture and the superior system and the superior people. So it was a war of image a lot of times, with some potentially disastrous consequences because we're talking about powerful nations going against each other. All right, after World War II, this is the post-Europe World War II. You see that there's a chunk of territories that the Soviet Union occupied that they promised they would set free, but they didn't. And you also see something interesting that happened with Germany after World War II. If we zoom in here, Germany was split into two parts. If we go back for a second, you see that this part was the Russian occupied part, and this part was the part that Britain, the United States, and France occupied. So the country was split into a democratic side and a communist side. So that's the answer to question one. As you can see here, split into a communist and a democratic section of Germany. And then what's interesting about that, in this area, this is about where the city of Berlin would be located in the country of Germany. So if you look at it, that's about where the capital city would be of Germany when it was all one country. But what's interesting has happened in the city of Germany. This is the city of Germany. So all surrounding this city is the communist-controlled East Germany. But in the city of Berlin, it was divided just like the nation was divided. The eastern side of the city of Berlin was communist controlled. The western side of the city of Berlin was controlled by, you see here, French, British, and Americans. And it was democratic. So even if you walked out of the boundary of this city into this area, you were in communist East Germany. But if you lived in the western part of the capital city of Berlin, you lived under a democracy. So oddly divided was the nation of Germany after World War II. All right, another thing that was kind of interesting. Let's go back to our definitions real quick to put some context in this next point. Now, this was created after World War II. If you remember, after World War I, they created the League of Nations, which really wasn't very effective and didn't have a lot of power. So the United Nations was created after World War II. And this is an international peacekeeping group of world nations that was created after World War II to replace the League of Nations. And if you've been to New York, maybe you've seen the meeting building with all the flags of the representative countries leading up to the entrance. This is a place where nations can discuss issues and talk about things instead of going to war. And in some cases, it has helped avert crisis, and in some cases, it has shown to be just as ineffective as the League of Nations was. Depends on the situation. All right, this is the UN Security Council. This is a select group. So this kind of goes with the definition of 5 permanent member nations that have veto power over any Security Council decision. So you can see here you've got Britain, United States, you have excuse me, China, you have France, should be Russia is the 5th one here. It's weird. But they have this this veto power as a very select group of kind of the leaders of the world after World War II ended. All right, China was interesting because it started off democratic and then it became communist. And that kind of happened overnight, which was kind of unusual. This huge chunk right here of China was democratic, and then overnight it became communist because they've been fighting each other. We talked about that in a previous chapter. And the government leaders of China ran and hid on this tiny little island here off the coast of Taiwan. Interestingly enough, the United States refused to acknowledge this as China and would only acknowledge this as China because they only acknowledged the non communist part. So that happened. So this gave another communist voice and to the Security Council and in the United Nations. It was largely created to stop the spread of communism, and another major contributor in the United Nations became communist very early in after World War II. So just set the stage for some things that are going on here in the world after World War II. All right, let's look at a couple of instances of significance. Going back here to the city of Berlin, the Russians tried to cut off the entire city and try to make an entire city theirs. Having this divided city was kind of an embarrassment to the Russians. So in June of 1948, they cut off the whole city on the outside. So no supplies could get into the western part. So hopefully they would starve them and then they would give up. And then Russia could have the entire city. So why did the Soviets cut off the city? They cut off access to West Berlin from the Allies, and they wanted to control the entire city. And the response from Britain, France, the United States, they couldn't get any supplies in to Western Berlin because all the roads had been cut off. So they flew over the city and they dropped these supplies into the city to give them what they needed to survive. It was called the Berlin Airlift, hence the name of the incident. So they flew over the city, dropped these supplies in so the people in West Berlin weren't starved to death and didn't have to give up. And this became an interesting incident. So this was kind of if you think about this, this was a victory for the Democratic side. This was a victory for the United States because Russia tried to steal West Berlin out of their control, and they came up with a creative way to go against that without starting a war. So victory, the United States, and democracy from this particular incident. All right, if we go back to our definitions real quick. We'll get to that in a second. This is the leader of Russia. So question one, the leader who arranged for nuclear technology in Cuba. After Stalin had died, the next leader who came in was Nikita Khrushchev, and he arranged for nuclear missile facilities to start to be built in Cuba. Cuba was also a communist country, and so he set that up. Cuba is also like 90 miles off the coast of Florida, so it's very, very close to the United States, and got a lot of Americans super nervous that there would be a communist country with nuclear technology right on their border. All right, so the American response to this incident is as it says here in the article, the United States blockaded Cuba, so they sent their ships to kind of stand around the perimeter of Cuba because it's an island, and they stopped any supplies from coming in until the Cubans got rid of that nuclear capability. And they justified this. The USSR justified putting nuclear weapons in Cuba because they said, look, the United States, you have nuclear weapons in Turkey. Turkey is just south of Russia. It's actually closer to Russia than Cuba is to the United States. And so the justification here was, look, if you can have nuclear weapons right off the outside the border of our nation, we should be able to do the same thing to you. I don't know what you're so upset about. So this became a stalemate. The United States said, take these missiles out or else. Russia said, we're not going to take these missiles out or else, and it became a very, very scary situation. This imaginary line was drawn in the ocean here. The United States said, if these Russian ships carrying nuclear technology, if they pass this line, you see them out in the ocean here, then that is an act of war, and we will retaliate with full nuclear arsenal. And the Russians said, if you attack our ships, then that'll be a declaration of war, and we'll attack with full nuclear arsenal. And the entire world pretty much braced for nuclear war. As the ships got closer and closer and closer to the line, the world pretty much expected this was going to be the nuclear war that everybody was fearing. This was going to trigger it. But in the end, the Russian the Russian ships, so they were sent in anyway. Even the United States blockaded Cuba and said go away. They sent them in anyway. But eventually, the Russians retreated, and this is a significant event because in the whole course of the Cold War, this is the closest the world has ever come to nuclear war. I remember my dad and mom telling me that they were doing drills in classrooms about, once a nuclear bomb goes off, the kids get under their desk because everybody knows a, a classroom desk is going to save you from a nuclear bomb. And so they were doing all these rituals, and so people were building bomb shelters underneath their homes, be thinking the end of the world was going to happen, stockpiling, grocery supplies and stuff like that. It was a pretty scary, significant event. All right, the next thing of significance that happened in the Cold War, and this is an actual war. You have Korea was divided just like it is today between communist North Korea and democratic South Korea. All right, and this conflict started when North Korea decided to invade South Korea. They got a lot of support from China, and they invaded and almost took over the entire section of South Korea. Right, the United Nations responded to this act of aggression. They sent General MacArthur, who had experience during World War II, to go in there and liberate South Korea. In fact, they did liberate South Korea, and they almost completely went the opposite direction and totally took over North Korea. And then China and Russia sent in troops to push them back. So it's just this crazy back and forth sort of thing. All right, the reason that the troops were allowed, you would think Russia would just veto that action because they're in the Security Council, but they weren't present when this decision was made because they were protesting excluding China, the bigger continent of China, from the Security Council and the UN. So while they were gone, the other countries decided to vote to send troops to liberate South Korea from North Korea. So they both pushed. North Korea pushed into South Korea. South Korea pushed back into North Korea. But eventually they settled on a point that is the dividing line today. It's called the 38th parallel. And that's where they decided to draw the neutral line. And then today there's a demilitarized zone with no troops and a bunch of landmines in between North and South Korea. And that's the dividing line between the two parts. So that's just the Korean War. Another instance of actual conflict happened in Vietnam. Okay, so Vietnam War happened for a similar reason here. Let me back up here real quick. So this started for the same reason. North Vietnam, you see, also touches China, invaded South Vietnam. The democratic South Vietnam was invaded by the communist North Vietnam, and that's what triggered this sort of conflict. And then in the name of trying to defend free countries from communist takeover, the United States, the United Nations got involved. All right, the final outcome of this was eventually the United States just said enough, and they just withdrew all their troops. They didn't negotiate really a treaty. They didn't give up. They didn't officially lose, but they definitely didn't win. So this was super embarrassing. That back in the United States, obviously there was a lot of protest against the Vietnam War and being involved in the Vietnam War. So the government just eventually bowed out. We're like, we're not going to do this anymore. And this was a black eye. Technically, it's considered a loss. So it's really the only major conflict the United States has lost since 1776. But whether loss or not, this is definitely a perceived weaker opponent that the United States had to just leave and couldn't win. So that was definitely a black eye for whereas Korea is kind of a victory for democracy and a loss by communism. This is actually more of a victory for communism. They were able to resist the much stronger United States.